wonderful to see you all. It sounds like everyone had a very, very good coffee break and tea break. Before I forget, the next tea break, unfortunately, will only be 15 minutes, so I'm not sure how you're all going to get out again and back in, but that's what I've been told. Welcome to this second session on harnessing markets to protect and restore nature. Really important topic. A necessary condition for us to turn the tide, for us to restore, protect nature in the UK and globally, is to make sure that capital can flow into solutions to environmental challenges, as well as move away from activities that harm the environment. And we need to do this quickly, we need to do this at scale, not just in the UK, but also globally. And I would argue this is one of the greatest public policy challenges of our time. The window of opportunity to act is narrowing very, very quickly. And we have a very distinguished and excellent panel to discuss some of these topics. And we're going to try and examine some of the following questions. How do we create the price signals, the cash flows for nature conservation and restoration? How do we pay people, companies, NGOs to protect and restore nature? How can we get financial institutions of different kinds to provide the capital and the financial services at the required scale and pace? Really big challenge. What's the role of government in creating and driving these markets? What are the market failures in the real economy, but also in the financial economy that are hindering progress? And what examples, what case studies can we draw on to help us navigate all of these issues? And critically, what should this government now be doing or not doing to address these questions, given that the time is incredibly short? I'm not going to introduce each of the panelists, they can introduce themselves, but we're going to have very short 3-minute interventions from each, and then we're going to open it up for hopefully what will be a vibrant discussion. So please do think about questions you want to ask this panel. Helen, you've been asked. You are first.
Okay.
Sorry, over to you.
Hi, it's lovely to be here. I'm Helen Avery. I'm Head of Nature Programmes at the Green Finance Institute and Director of GFI Hive. Just briefly, the work we do, and there's a lot of questions here. I think it's fantastic. Wish we had longer than the time we have to discuss. My team, our role, and it's a team of two, to be fair, is to look at how we can mobilise private finance to meet some of the UK nature goals. And we started this by just sort of assessing, well, actually, what is the investment needed? And we commissioned FTech to look at that, and that report came out in October that showed there's an investment gap of at best £44 billion over the next decade, and at worst about £97 billion. So obviously a lot of investment is going to need to happen, and we know that's going to have to come from the private sector. And the way we look at it is that for that to happen, we need 3 things to happen. One, we need the infrastructure to be in place. So that's everything from policy and regulatory levers that create those cash flows and revenue streams to be able to bring in private finance. All through to data and standards and metrics and oversight and governance. Working with Broadway and Finance Earth, there's a report coming out on that in March that sort of frame up how we build that market infrastructure. The second is we need to build pipeline, so supporting companies as they want to shift to nature positive and thinking about how they can do that, the finance that could come in, but also developing that pipeline of projects that's sort of testing the possible. And we do that, we work with EA and DEFRA on the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, some work in Scotland. And then finally, it's about building the demand. So infrastructure, supply, building the supply, and then building the demand. So we launched GFI Hive in December, and that is really to build the demand in the finance sector. So it's knowledge sharing hub, we share case studies so the finance sector can see what is possible, because at the moment there's not much confidence of what can happen, but there are lots of things happening around the world, if not necessarily in the UK, although there is a lot happening here in the UK. And then finally, to bring that all together, we're running work streams specifically looking at large scale, how we can bring finance in at a large scale in landscape scale projects, whether it's peatland or woodland, sustainable agriculture. We think there's a really big role for private finance to play in supporting that transition. And then finally, natural flood management. We'd love to see the insurance sector get more involved. So that's where we are.
Great, thanks, Helen. A quick question for you. So when you said that you were doing the estimate of the investment gap in the UK, the range 44 billion to 90-something billion, that's in total or per year?
That is in total for the decade, yeah.
And I think people might be able to correct me. There was a Paulson Institute study that came out maybe a year or two ago, and that was looking at the annual investment gap globally, and that was something like 800 billion per year, I think. So very big numbers, basically. And do you think we can close that gap?
Well, Treasury has set a target for £1 billion a year to come in by 2030. I do, 100 billion. Yeah, it's going to be a push. But we're not saying that 100 billion, if we say 97 billion, so sorry if I'm rounding up to 100, all has to come from private finance. We're just saying private finance should play a role in helping that. So fingers crossed.
But for context, if the public money available is about, if you assume that all the money, all the subsidy going to farmers was actually aligned with nature recovery, which it isn't, as we'll talk about, that's about 3 billion per year. Right, so that just to show the gap that needs to be filled through other sources, not through public funds. Siobhan, over to you.
Oh, it's lovely to be here, and thanks for having me. So I am the MP for Stroud. It's an incredibly green-focused constituency. It's the home of Extinction Rebellion, who are often outside of my office if they're not on motorways and all sorts of other things. But joking aside, that we're not always on the same page with certain campaign groups where we absolutely share the passion for nature and for protecting the climate. I receive hundreds of letters from school children, from Stroud school children who really care about this. I have the absolute privilege of having the headquarters for the Wetlands and Wildfowl Trust, Slimbridge, in my patch. So I am the chair of the APPG for wetlands, and we have an ambition to have 100,000 more hectares of wetlands in the country, and a real sort of focus on a blue recovery. And I hope to talk a little bit more about the salt marsh carbon code and what we're doing there. But I think the debates about markets and their involvement in the climate sort of challenge is really important and timely. We cannot afford to do this alone. The country cannot afford to do this alone. We probably couldn't even before there was a massive pandemic-shaped black hole in the finances. So we do need the private investment, but it's not only because we need their cash, it's because we also need to bring along their customers and their ethos and their CSR policies, because in that way you bring a whole country along with you. So I think that is really important. And the reason it is timely, all of you in this room will realise, is on a political basis. I think we're going to have to remake some of the case for reaching for addressing the net zero target because of the cost of people's purse. And we have to be honest about that, and we have to be realistic about it. And it's brought into sharp focus at the moment because of the energy crisis and the reality of what that's doing to everybody's finances at home. And we know that reaching a net zero target by 2050, which is not quick enough for a lot of my people in my constituency, but it's certainly a realistic thing, is going to cost. It's going to cost businesses, it's going to cost all of us. But this government is so committed to it, and I believe that with the practical approach of conservatism and the belief from Conservatives that it's our job to conserve and protect and to be custodians of the future, that we are the correct government, the correct party to do it, and so I've worked with a lot of businesses on things like green skills and thinking about how we change people's attitudes and change people's lives and make this a positive thing. So I'm excited by the challenge, but I think we have to be very realistic, and that's why unusually for politicians who usually like the sound of their own voice, I'm hoping to speak as little as possible today because I think the panel is so good, and I think it does come down to a network of the charity sector working with private investors and working with government to make this happen. Thank you.
So one follow-up question. The politics of this, given that you're the politician on the panel, presumably this is a no-brainer. When you're knocking on the doorsteps of Stroud, are people presumably very supportive of protecting and restoring nature? Who could be against that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that restoring nature and protecting biodiversity and species is actually a bigger selling point than sometimes when we get caught up talking about carbon and climate and sort of and futuristic things. So that is a no-brainer. But what I don't think there has been a sort of a wide understanding of what it means to individuals and what it means to households. So that's where I think the politics will come in, and I think it's the right debate to have, and perhaps we didn't have it. We put the 2050 target in place very, very fast. I'm really pleased we did, because otherwise it wouldn't be here now. We've been very, very busy dealing with the pandemic naturally, and I think this debate is a really important one. So.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. So Emily, you're next.
Chairman, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Microphone, okay, good. Closer. I'll shout for you. Is that better? Okay, all right. So my name is Emily Norton. I am head of rural research at Savills, the property consultancy. We advise on about 3.5 million acres of land across England and Scotland predominantly. I'm also chair of the Oxford Farming Conference for this year. So it's a real joy and privilege to be here. I was tasked to think a little bit about the opportunities for farmers and in particular how to ensure farmers can access these markets, and it's a particularly important topic, I think, to be thinking about these things. As we migrate away from the Common Agricultural Policy and the role that the Basic Payment Scheme has played, government has been the aggregator and the purchaser of outcomes from farming. And I think the magnitude of the transition from that to something where we've got essentially a free market for environmental services signalled by a lot of the policy that we're getting is really quite significant. And in our cross-sector briefing, which we've just published, I wrote that it's going to be the most substantial change to impact on land management since the land clearances, and I stand by that statement. I think the consequences and the magnitude of allowing private markets to dictate the most optimum use of resources based on the availability of land, as opposed to having an effective government aggregator understanding what outcomes are going to go where and who is incentivised to deliver these outcomes, is potentially something we really have to pay attention to. So just 3 points I wanted to make in these few minutes that I've got. The first of all is that we hear our lords and masters within government tell us that the replacement, the environmental land management scheme, is going to be fairer for farmers than the basic payment scheme has. I can say now it's not. It's still going to be entirely dictated by how much land you have access to and fundamentally what you are able to do with that land. So every single parcel of land in this country is completely different, and the amount of environment, the amount of natural capital that you can deliver from it is therefore also different. There's no understanding that this new scheme of the environmental land management mixed with private markets is going to be fairer. So I would, just park that with you, that there's going to be winners and losers from this transition. The second, and we see real evidence of this at the moment within the land value and market transaction information that we see, is that the lack of an effective aggregator sitting between private demands and the people who are currently incentivised to deliver land management outcomes means that the financialisation of natural capital is going into land values. We see that in a 60% increase in commercial forestry values during last year. We predicted it was going to go up 6%, and it went up 60%. That's what the market wants to pay for those assets, those authentic carbon assets. And interestingly as well, a 31% increase in Scottish land values during last year. I mean, that's a substantial increase because people are seeing those as offsetting opportunities, and there aren't the partnerships there that enable farmers and the land managers that we've currently got to deliver those outcomes on behalf of the private market. I think the third point I wanted to make was that farmers gain no benefit if their carbon is sold to a third party. That carbon then becomes an asset which is owned by somebody else. They can't make any claims about how net zero they are, how environmentally friendly they are, if that carbon has been sold to a third party. So if you are looking at selling to an insurance firm or an airline or anyone else who's undertaking economic activity and is told that they need to be net zero and purchase offsets, that carbon becomes an asset of somebody else. The big unsaid thing in the room about this at the moment is the power of supply chains and the fact that supply chains who are buying the produce of farms also need to be net zero. Those are the ones who we really need to start thinking about being accountable for land management practices. And in all of this understanding of where private markets might go to, it's the competition between offsetters creating economic wealth who can afford to buy land management outcomes, and our retail sectors and food service sectors and energy sectors increasingly who need to buy the products of land, who are going to be competing for the same services. And the farmers are expected to cope with those behemoths of power sitting either side of them and try to make sense of this. It's not going to work.
Great, thank you, Emily. So really, really interesting that you're starting to see these changes being priced into the market. But when you're looking at the other areas that aren't forestry, where it's very obvious, very clear that there's this carbon sequestration value, to what extent are you seeing differentiation between different types of land in the UK based on the potential for elm cash flows?
Yep, so the difference between what's happened with Scottish land values and English land values is a real symptom of that. So, but it's across what we call poor livestock land, so the upland grades of land, which have seen the greatest increases in land value uplift during the last year specifically. And that's dramatic, and actually we see a lot of press coverage, particularly from Wales. It's beginning to be criticised that this land has been appropriated by people who have got different motives than the entrenched community interests that are there. So that's the disruption you're going to have to think about.
Well, so the sort of the paper land value of a lot of landowners and farmers in the UK has increased significantly over the last year or two because of this change of policy.
Absolutely, and does it help them live? Does it help them buy their inputs? Does it help them create a crop? Does it help them be more sustainable? Of course it doesn't, it's just a land value, it's an asset value. So what we really need to think is how we are incentivising land management practices and sustainable agricultural practices that deliver for biodiversity, deliver food, deliver these net zero outcomes, whilst understanding that there are inherently trade-offs as to how the market is beginning to price those different outcomes and who has the power dynamics in that space.
Absolutely, but greater asset values mean that they can potentially borrow more money to invest in some of those things, potentially.
I'm going to say yes, but it's not necessarily a good outcome.
That's true.
Yeah, because you need to be able to service the debt. Yeah, so you need to be a trading, functioning business, which at the moment, it comes back to this point that you can only do that if you've got scale. So you're still going to have, in theory, fewer, bigger businesses.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Lots there, very, very interesting. Matthew, from the Broadway Initiative, over to you. Thank you for joining.
Great, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. So I work for the Broadway Initiative, which is a cross-sector initiative bringing together the main business sectors in the economy through their business associations and also connecting them with the major NGOs. So Green Alliance, I can see Sean Spires is here today. I'm actually standing in for Guy Thompson, a senior Broadway member. He's really sorry he can't be here today. He's got COVID, unfortunately. So he is a real expert in this field. He's managing director of Entrade, which is one of the main environmental trading mechanisms, environmental services. Definitely someone worth connecting with if you're interested in this agenda. But I'll try and do justice to what Guy would have talked about. I think the challenge is pretty sort of well understood. Government has shown real ambition in pledging to restore nature within a generation. Some great things going on. The Prime Minister's 10-point plan for net zero, the Environment Act, the shift to public money for public services in agriculture, 25-year environment plan. But we don't yet have a mechanism and a strategy for bringing in the private finance, which government documents often talk about being part of the solution, as colleagues on the panel have said. And we know that public funding and charitable funding alone will not be enough to restore nature. We know from the Dasgupta report that there are real economics and market failures. It's difficult for investors to price risk in terms of investing in nature, that's stopping as much private finance come through as we would like. I don't think there's any silver bullet solution to this. I think the sort of things you'll hear about from the panel, the need to have high integrity markets, the need to have blended finance mechanisms, the need for assurance schemes, so we know what environmental services, restoration projects are actually delivering over time, the need for common standards, so buyers and sellers can interact with a common language, better corporate disclosure. I think those are all important. I don't think there's one silver bullet. So what's Broadway's initiative's specific role in this? We've worked with the GFI and other organisations to pull together a coalition, the Financing UK Nature Recovery Coalition, to look at how we can develop a market framework that would work effectively. And we've worked closely with officials in government, with about 200 stakeholders across the finance community and across the main sort of market sectors. I think a lot of our initial work has shown that many of the barriers to private sector investment in nature are regulatory barriers. So partly that's because regulation tends to work in silos, so carbon regulation is not really connected with the broader environmental services and nature regulation. You often get perverse incentives. So if you look at the water sector, you've got the economic regulator Ofwat, and you've got environmental regulation, and you end up with a sort of perverse incentive to invest in hard engineering solutions where actually nature-based solutions would be much more effective. So we're planning to produce a report, as Helen said, in a couple of months' time, But just today, I guess I'd sort of pick out 3 things in advance of that report that I think might sort of help move the dial. So the first is a sector-based nature positive obligation to be introduced initially in sectors which rely most for their value added in terms of natural resources. So that's things like retail, fashion and so forth. It would work a little bit like renewables obligation. So firms within those sectors would be required to acquire nature positive credits, and those credits could be generated by accredited environmental services that would derive from nature restoration projects. You'd scale it up over time. Part of the aim would be to create a pipeline of projects that people could invest in, but it would be a way to translate the 2030 very high level target, species abundance, into a demand to actually restore quantifiable or targets with quantifiable outcomes in terms of different types of habitat. Secondly, I think we need much clearer standards for the environmental services from nature restoration projects. I think something like the Woodland Carbon Code may be a good model to use. So we should be charging DEFRA to develop environmental standards which would be a bit like the Woodland Carbon Code, but for all environmental services and all land types. And thirdly, I think again, to try and get the private sector investment moving, we could look at allocating a portion of L money on a basis that had to be matched by private finance. I think L money needs to be deployed on a catchment basis tied to genuine environmental outcomes, but you could tie a portion of it to match funding. So 3 thoughts there, Ben, that might move things forward.
Lots of very good thoughts. Thank you. All right, let's go to Tom last, but I know
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Tom. I'm the second COVID understudy on the panel today, stepping in for Naomi Conway from National Parks Partnerships. My family's from Stroud, grew up in the Cotswolds, but I actually used to work on rainforests. I lived in Indonesia for several years and came back to the UK last spring because I think that the changes that are happening in UK land use policy are so exciting that I wanted to work on them. So here I am. The stuff that I used to do in the tropics was with a company called Palladium, and we run a large program across South America, Central African Congo Basin, and Southeast Asian forests to try to develop business models that could compete with the businesses that are driving the destruction of rainforests. So how can we design a model that makes money and can compete with, say, monoculture palm oil plantations or destructive logging? And we've worked with about 60 different businesses across the tropics, looking at sustainable rubber that goes into shoes, or bamboo to go to IKEA, or nuts and oils that are sold to Lush Cosmetics. And we found actually that these models do exist, and with the right type of support they can grow, and you can get quite a lot of investment into them. We've managed to mobilize about $250 million over the last 5 years. So that was quite fun and exciting. And last year we started talking to the national parks in the UK and about whether the same thing could be done across some of the landscapes that we have in Britain. And when we began to look into it, I personally got really excited because, mainly because of the work that DEFRA has done to leave the Common Agricultural Policy, actually. One of the most difficult things about the businesses we worked on in the tropics was that you're always competing with other businesses that destroy nature that are subsidized by their governments. And so you really start from a kind of losing position. You have to work your way up from there, and sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't. Whereas here, the playing field has been leveled, so you can really do something quite exciting. Also, the UK has all of these codes and mechanisms for generating and valuing ecosystem services like biodiversity net gain and the carbon codes and nutrient balancing. And so when we, after a few months of talking with the parks, we said, okay, well, how about we set up what Emily was talking about, an aggregator to develop projects with farmers and landowners, not buying land, but working with people who already have land, to say, okay, well, how can you design projects that restore nature and generate a new source of income for you as the manager of the land? An aggregator up to a scale that could actually attract private investment. And so we're working with landowners across the Cairngorms National Park to do a large-scale peatland restoration program, working with farmers in Yorkshire on woodland, farmers in the South Downs on woodland pasture. All of these are built on models that bring in revenues from carbon or from biodiversity net gain or from nutrient balancing. And I think we've still got a lot to prove to show that these models really can work. The economics are, no one's going to make an absolute killing out of this. The economics are quite tight, but if they do work, which we think they can, then we're seeing so much interest from companies and from investors to get involved in this space that I think we really could start bringing in some significant money to fund nature and new incomes for farmers. So,
Brilliant.
let's see.
Thank you, Tom. Quick question. So you said you're doing this for national parks. Presumably you can do it outside of national parks. Does doing that outside of national parks make any difference to the economics?
No, it wouldn't make any difference to the economics. I think what's great about working with the parks is that the teams in the park authorities, they know so many of the landowners across the landscapes that they manage. And this role that Emily was talking about, having an aggregator, you need, I think, organizations that can support individual landowners to work together to change a landscape that's beyond just the boundaries of the land they own, and also to negotiate fair deals with investors or with the buyers of these services so that you avoid some of the problems that Emily was talking about. So, if you're using a soil carbon model, for example, then you really wouldn't want to sell all of your carbon credits to an insurance company or an airline industry, because if your supermarket starts saying, well, I want net zero carrots, and you've sold all of your carbon to an airline, then you can't do net zero carrots. So I think these support roles to work with several farmers at once are actually really interesting, and the national parks can play that role.
And the economics currently stacks up. You're not basing it on future changes.
The economics can stack up. You've got to design it in the right way. I think one thing that would really help is tax relief on some of these investments. So you can get tax relief if you invest in the movie business. You can get tax relief if you invest in startups in the UK. I think you should be able to get tax relief if you invest in sustainable nature restoration as well.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Tom. And thank you for the panel for making those contributions. So we've got half an hour now to have a bit of a discussion and take questions from the audience. So who wants to go first? And if you could say who you are and your affiliation, that would be great. We have roving mics. And the gentleman just there. Oh, so we've got a mic because we're broadcasting. So.
Daniel Schieven, Eco-Energy, operator and investor in biogas. I suppose that's a prompt, if anything, for you, Emily and Tom, to also consider that as part of the initiatives that you're working on. In both cases, it's, I think, something that can only promote the conservation of nature, because you're taking that waste from it and bringing it all back as a fertilizer. And also you're actually capturing the CO2 that again is used as part of fertilizer, but also for other uses of the economy.
Great, a biogas question. Other questions? I'll take a batch, if there is a batch. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Connor Tomlinson, British Conservation Alliance, here to annoy you all. I was quite encouraged by the last panel, and obviously this one particularly, something that Tom said right at the end about not only the rewilding on the last panel, but also the idea that it should be supply side and sort of tax relief based, rather than the idea that we should create a subsidy system of redistributing everything and have the government bureaucracy that can get things wrong, as Emily said. Is anyone aware of any policy-based conversations that have gone towards nature recovery efforts that have been funded through tax exemptions rather than, redistributing money? I would be happy to hear them.
I think changing tax policy is redistributing money, actually. Anyway, but we can talk more about specifically tax exemptions. Okay, do you want to address the biogas question? I think that was for you, Matt. Was that right? Who? Emily, sorry.
Yeah, biogas is a clear opportunity, but I suppose in this context it speaks to the competition for land and the competition for resources, and to ensure that what we are doing is as much as possible tackling unavoidable waste streams and repurposing those, and creating energy crops and growing energy crops for biogas. I farm in the east of England, and it does funny things to rents when you start subsidising a sector in order to produce it. So I think, again, it's just being aware of the unintended consequences of dealing with a waste stream that creates then an input value that appropriates land for something else.
As I said, you take the waste from the environment. You wouldn't want to necessarily promote
It doesn't necessarily need to be grown to produce biogas.
Well, it has to be
existing offshoots from things, and also you can use some rural rubbish as well.
Yeah, if you're, I guess if you're using what was purely a waste stream, then absolutely, it's when the economics of it mean that you need the consistent quality in order to make the system work, and that's where you need, for example, a maize-based input to ensure that you've got consistent feedstock. So it's.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a great idea. Yeah.
Helen, did you want to come in? Maybe on the tax question.
I think it's a really good point. There's a project at the moment that has applied for social investment tax relief. I don't know if it's public, which that project is, so I won't mention it. I don't know, Tom, you probably know it. But if that happens, that will be a game changer, I think, for these environmental projects. So that's the only one I've heard of so far, but that will be the first of its kind. And it's a pretty big project in. It's not billions, but it's a big project for the UK.
And who's making, so there's a Treasury decision that's pending?
Yeah.
Right, interesting. Tom, do you want to say a bit more about your tax relief idea?
I think social investment tax relief is great. I think it only applies if you're running a community interest company or a social enterprise. I think a similar mechanism that was broadened to cover all types of investments into nature-based solutions or nature restoration in the UK would be super helpful.
Before my time, dealing with the legacy of inappropriate tree planting on the Flow Country in Scotland, which, as I understand it, was largely driven by tax. And so, again, dealing with the negative consequences of decisions driven by an inappropriate financial outcome. The other thing that I'm going to mention is inheritance tax, which actually, for people within land ownership, is a massive driver of how farm businesses operate. And at the moment, you are required to use your land for agricultural purposes in order to benefit from those exemptions. And there is a question mark if you predominantly shift to using your land for environmental purposes, whether you qualify for the same reliefs. So the definition of agriculture is quite strict, which if you're an institutional landowner or a corporate or a charity is fine. You can do interesting things with your land and let it on all sorts of interesting and innovative basis. If you're a private owner of land, you are more restricted at the moment because of the inheritance tax exemptions. And any accountant or land agent will start sucking air through their teeth if you kind of come up with something creative to do with your land that's not farming.
Sure.
All I would say is that Emily makes some really good points, and I think thinking about the practical lives of farmers and the general nerves through our farming communities about what's happening, even though we know that there's also a lot of opportunity and amazing good coming. But I think we've got to be aware of the unintended consequences. I mean, we're effectively spending all of our time focusing on trying not to repeat the unintended consequences of the Common Agricultural Policy. And the Chancellor is so clear that he wants us to be I wrote this down, the world's first net zero aligned financial centre. I am really confident that this Chancellor and this government is really looking at all of the options, and that would involve tax incentives, tax relief, that would involve things like the land management schemes, things like the National Nature Environmental Investment Readiness Fund, which is a £10 million pot, and that will be working with charities. So I think that kind of looking across the range, but we can get very narrow into it. We've got a lot of conversations about VAT, and we probably could have a very long conversation about scrapping inheritance tax, which a lot of people would like. But actually, let's just look at constantly what works for individual projects, what works for individual groups of people, what works for individual sectors, and see if we can be a bit more flexible than where we've just clawed our way out of with the EU.
Yeah, okay, more questions. Excellent, good. Lady there.
Thank you very much. Vicky Hurd from Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming. Great presentations. I must say, Ben, I'm finding it hard to hear you, just so maybe it's my age. I have two questions, if I may. The first one is whether the panel feels that we have come to a time when we do need to have, in England in particular, some sort of land use framework and assessment at a national level. Obviously, we're going to be leaving it a lot to local nature recovery strategies, which could be a fantastic outlet, but
there are so many pressures on land, and as Emily pointed out, those pressures are going to be squeezing farmers particularly hard. So that's one question: should we have a land use framework democratically assessed for England land? Second question, very quick one about supply chain, which also Emily referred to, which is squeezing farmers ever more and is an incredibly competitive, particularly in retail sector. So how does that fit in with investment coming from the other side to push farmers to do one thing where we haven't got adequate regulation of the supply chain at the other end of the squeeze? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, and a question over there.
Thank you. Name is Samit Ahuja. We specialize in biodiversity bonds and currently helping governments in India, various African nations, Southeast Asian nations, and Latin American nations to issue biodiversity bonds. So India, on the Ganges cleanup, is embarking on a 10 billion bond. Zambia and Namibia are embarking on conservation bonds. Ecuador is embarking on the same. And the common theme, underlying theme amongst all of those bond issuances is the fact that the governments have found a mechanism to bring natural capital onto the balance sheets of local councils and the landowners. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, you're trying to find those revenue streams, artificial revenue streams from elsewhere. So I wonder what the panel has to say in what's being done in the UK to bring that natural capital from a regulatory perspective onto the balance sheets.
Great, thank you. I'm wondering whether we're going to do those questions first. So Emily, maybe you could address that latter question, and then let's start there.
It's really unfair, that's the tricky question.
Happy to help. Well, I thought you might.
I'd be interested, Helen, is that what you...
I was hoping to hear you first.
I mean, yeah, okay, right. So natural capital is capital, it's not revenue, okay? So it's not income, it's not natural income. And I think the more we understand that what we're talking about is investing in capital, we're not enabling income, the closer we get. And actually a lot of the revenue models that we've looked at have really struggled to find the market returns in the investable model. So a lot of people are looking at biodiversity net gain as a way to go, okay, well, there's a clear income stream associated with that, or there's carbon, there's a clear income stream, and that becomes the investment case, but that doesn't then reflect the overall totality of our multifunctional land uses and how you get that balance, which the product approach, Tom, which was really, you're buying the products and selling the products from those places, again, is a business case for doing that. But I think what we're struggling with is those investable business models. So yes, get it on the balance sheet, absolutely, but where's the investable business model? Where's the return coming from an investor perspective?
And Helen, how about biodiversity bonds?
Oh, I'm really interested in that. And I mean, it is a difficult question, and that's obviously where we'd like to get to, where natural capital is measured in. I mean, that was the whole point of the scripture review. I think it's linked back to the supply chain question, actually, and I'm sort of trying to shoehorn two things together, but you have to create that behavioural change. We host the Secretariat with the UN for the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and that's sort of in development now, and hopefully will launch at the end of next year. But to me, that will hopefully force corporates to look at through their supply chains to see where they're having a negative impact on biodiversity and where the dependencies are, and then invest through those, which would be, if it ends up being mandated down the line, you never know, it depends what comes out of the framework, that would be a game changer, because then all of a sudden you've got that wall of money from institutions looking to invest in their farmers to help them change their practices. And so I think, and then you start to see natural capital actually becoming embedded in accounts. So a lovely question. I'd love to pick up with you about biodiversity bonds and see how those revenue streams are being created, because I think that's the...
Governments have to take that leap of faith and guide. If you leave it just to the private sector will always look at the IRRs, where's the money, right? But if governments stand right front and center, you don't know the right answer. You got to do a few pilots and say that for the first few bonds, so Indian government said 10 billion is our figure, billion a year for the next 10 years. Zambia is doing the same, Namibia is doing the same. So I'm happy to share that experience with you.
And Tom, and then maybe Siobhan, do you want to come in on this question about democratic accountability and input into land management plans?
Is this for the land use framework at a national level, or?
Well, that's national and subnational, presumably, as well.
I think land managers should choose what they want to do with their land. I did quite like the idea in the food strategy for England that Henry Dimbleby published last year that said that we could maybe think about 3 compartments for land use in the UK. One would be where there's the best land for food production, we focus on producing food. The other is where there's marginal land where you can't really produce food economically without subsidies, then that could be prioritized for nature restoration. And then there's a third area of land that's somewhere in between. It's a mix of some land that's good for production, some that's not. And that's where you can do some quite interesting models where maybe you own a farm and you do a bit of food production and then you have some land set aside for nature and you get subsidies or private payments. I find that quite a helpful way to think about it, and I think goes some way towards the kind of addressing the concerns raised by some people that, if we go really guns blazing on this idea, then are we going to undermine food production in the UK? I don't think we would, but this idea of 3 different types of land use, I think is quite useful, but it should be up to people to choose what they want to do.
Any views?
Well, I just think the democratic accountability, if you don't get buy-in from everybody in your local area, and even for the bonds, businesses are asking for buy-in from government to make sure that they've got some support. Local councils need buy-in from local people, not least because they'll be thinking about the next election. But if we don't do that and do that well with things like the local nature government schemes and the partnerships, Gloucestershire's quite a long way ahead with our partnership, and we've literally rolled in all the different layers of council. So, and that could be quite a good model to be rolled up. But if you don't do that, these plans and schemes and ideas and pilots, they won't survive past a change of administration in the local council or a change of government. And I think George Eustace made this point earlier in his speech. It has to be sustainable in terms of 10, 20 years' time. So all of this work is not lost because it is for our futures. But I get the sense that so many sectors, businesses, councils are holding their breath and waiting to be told, when actually we need to create an environment where people can just try things and feel supported in trying them, and will fail in some, but that we'll see new winners and losers, and then we'll learn from that.
Yeah, great. Okay, another batch of... Sorry.
Just pick up Tom's point about the need to combine in farming both food production and environmental services. Hesitant to get too far into this with such an expert beside me, but I think it is important that we don't give the impression that the end result of these markets will be some very distorted choices between food production and environmental services. I would have thought in most cases the future of farming will be that combination, and I think that's why we felt that this sort of sector-based nature positive obligation would actually generate sort of money into the system and allow the monetizing of a range of environmental services, not just carbon, so that farmers can combine the 2 things, the food production and environmental services, provided you have the standards and accreditation, so we're not double counting, and we've worked out additionality. And as if you focus it, if you trial it initially on certain sectors who are heavily dependent on natural resources for the value added, then I think you could scale it up over time, and as I say, it would translate the very high level Environment Act targets, species abundance, into actually more quantifiable demand for nature recovery.
Okay, next batch of questions. We have one over here, Stanley, and then the guy there.
Thanks so much. Well, my question is really on looking at the title of this panel, Harnessing Markets to Protect and Restore Nature. Okay. So if I think about this, what is really the driver of destruction of nature? It is consumption. It's consumer patterns. Okay. Years ago, I went 2 or 3 times for Friends of the Earth to Indonesia. This thought came to mind when Tom was mentioning it. Well, who is the real driver of destruction of the rainforests in Indonesia? It's us. It's perfectly us. And it's the palm oil and so on. So this is what I'd like the panel to reflect on. When we come now to look at the changes in agricultural systems which are going to happen, and you were mentioning, okay, one of the ways, of course, is if you don't want to have, things which don't work, you probably have to have production, agricultural production, where it produces most, I don't know, per hectare or whatever. In fact, there's some argument you probably don't need much land at all. You can have an enormous amount of agriculture produced, in multi units in East Anglia. Do you see? Coming back to my main point then, are we thinking enough about the power of markets to restore and protect nature? For example, one question to Tom. He said he worked in Indonesia. Did you read yesterday that the Indonesian government is planning to do a Brasilia and move the capital to Kalimantan? Well, honestly, shouldn't it be a priority of our government, including from the Prime Minister down, to say to the President of Indonesia, we're not at all in favour of you moving your capital, Kalimantan. Roughly speaking, you've destroyed almost all the other tropical rainforests in Indonesia. Yes, if Tony Juniper was here, he wrote a brilliant book pointing out there's still something left. Oh, is he here? Good old Tony. Pointing out there's still a bit left in Kalimantan. But heavens, it won't be there long.
Thank you, Sandy. Good question. We'll come to that. We'll take 3. So then if you pass it to the person behind you as well after you're done.
Thank you. My name's Casper Horton. I'm with a campaign group called 0 Hour. And I think following on from Stanley's point, in the UK, we look at territorial emissions and the impact of our territorial agriculture and production. How are UK markets, how are UK producers able to compete if we start to get stricter on the environmental obligations of farmers, for example? How are they going to compete with overseas imports if we're not including those in our nature targets and our emissions targets?
Great, thank you. Okay, and then...
Thank you. In terms of, from an ideological perspective within conservatism, I was wondering, do you think there is, and do you think there will always be a conflict between conservation in the terms that the government proposes environmentally in terms of reforesting and rewilding, that sort of thing, and conservation culturally of the kind of tradition, of the countryside within farming and game shooting and that sort of thing? Is that an inevitable conflict? And is that at all navigable, or is it just a conflict that's delayed? Thank you.
Okay, great. So I think one set of questions around, we spent a lot of time talking about the creation of new markets, but actually the existing market, the current market, the market, is not working and is broken and is driving a lot of these problems. So what can we do to reform existing market structures? That's one set of questions. Stanley was sort of looking at you, Tom, a bit, so I'll get you to start. And then whoever's interested in picking up the question about territorial emissions, and then the final question about this tension between what the central government's trying to do and culture and local priorities. So, Tom, you go first.
Okay. Well, on moving Jakarta, they actually have to move because it's flooding, because the sea level is rising. Well, partly because the sea level is rising, partly because they depleted the aquifer below the city so much that it's now collapsing into itself. So, got to move. I don't know whether it's the right or wrong thing to move to Kalimantan. I think on the power of markets and us as consumers to address the reasons why palm oil is destroying a lot of forests in Indonesia, I think it's interesting. I think that the UK, we should actually include our consumption footprint within our net zero targets rather than just looking at what we do in this country. We'd have a much harder job of reaching net zero if we did do that. And I think, I used to work on policy for tropical timber trading and trying to crack down on illegal logging, which is a massive business still. And what you need to do is change policies and then have enforcement teams to back up those policies to crack down on these things. But the work of doing these reforms and funding enforcement teams across the country to stamp out these black markets is so difficult and time-consuming that there needs to be some kind of reward for doing that. And I think the timber approach has struggled because there hasn't really been a positive market incentive. The Europeans and the Brits were pushing this for 15 years, and then when the certified tropical timber started arriving in the EU to say, look, we've built a system that will track timber from where it came from at the stump all the way through to the point of export, we can guarantee it's legal, really hard work building this system. And then we said, oh, well, you know, I'm not going to pay extra for that. You tell me it's legal, I expect it to be legal. And so there is, at the moment, we don't reward the massive amount of work that needs to go into changing policies. And I think we should start paying more.
Who wants to go next?
Just briefly on the international dimension is a real challenge, no doubt about it. I would hope that much stronger disclosure rules for global businesses, so I think, Helen, you mentioned the task force on nature-related disclosures, will start to have an impact. I think the other thing I just observe is on the carbon side of that debate, you know, embodied emissions and so forth, it's noticeable how carbon border taxes are being talked about more and more. So, you know, when I worked at the CBI on environmental issues back in the 2000s, and I would sometimes raise them in meetings, and the view was it's just not, you know, nothing we want to talk about. But you now quite increasingly hear people saying that might be the only solution. So whether there's, you know, a parallel debate around the nature, international supply chains, don't know.
I think there's a really important point here to make as well about what we can naturally produce well in this country, and particularly in the west of the country, in the uplands, as well as timber and carbon and all sorts of things. We rely on animals grazing in order to do an awful lot of our conservation work for us, and within a strict kind of carbon accounting approach, those animals get demonised because their natural output has a climate warming impact. But actually, in terms of the optimum land use, living a very balanced existence with ruminants and natural combinable crops or vegetable crops growing together in systems is the optimum way to do it. It's essentially, without wanting to get too odd about it, it's kind of the human imbalance, it's not the animal imbalance that's the problem here. So, you know, we see the livestock sector being demonised from a climate perspective, but really you have to tackle the consumption paradigm, and the consumption paradigm is that everything that we're consuming is too much. So, you know, understanding that what the land can naturally do, and then understanding what we're expecting it to do in order to be able to sustain the kind of lifestyles we want, is really where the tension has come from. But that's a much deeper and bigger societal and economic discussion than we're able to have in a simple conversation about a carbon border adjustment tax. So.
I think Stanley's right to raise consumers, and the reality of who has driven quite a lot of the damage is us, and businesses will react to what we are asking for and what we need. I think a lot of the change that will come from that, or increased change, is going to be education. The consumer protection law doesn't prevent companies and businesses from saying very clearly on their products, you know, or making environmental claims about where they've come from, what that means for the environment, but they don't really do that a lot. I mean, the only thing I do laugh at the most recent round of Amazon adverts, given how much packaging comes out of that company. But they're doing, you know, they're doing all these kind of, you see quite a lot of companies now doing very environmentally focused adverts. But I think that the law is there that can be used, so we could perhaps look more closely at labelling and information. But locally, I mean, people want to buy from local producers. I mean, I was a bit dismayed when Asda decided not to sell only the British beef recently. But they're talking about the costs. But actually, it needs customers to say, no, that is what we want. We want British beef, not only because it's a good product, but it's because we know it's good for the climate, and we know that it's not going to be travelling millions of miles to get here. So I think I'm hoping that the leaving the EU, this is just part and parcel of thinking a little bit more sustainably, and the education and the labelling and the understanding will come, but consumers are very much key.
Great. Another, do you want to come on?
I was just going to come in on that point about conservation, and is there a sort of a tension there? And I just think, I mean, it's an obvious point, but I just want to sort of get it out there. The moment this sort of whole thing about conservation is one thing, and then economies and people's livelihoods are another, is probably flawed. Well, I say is flawed. And that if we can sort of transition that whole conversation around to just thinking about places in terms of resilience, and nature protection and restoration is just part of resilience, in addition to diversifying economies, in addition to diversifying demographics within neighbourhoods, so there's a larger workforce. So I think it's sort of trying to I appreciate why we talk about conservation. It's kind of a charged word anyway that I think is probably on its way out. But rather thinking about nature within a broader picture of just building resilience. And agriculture obviously plays a huge role within that, so think of them together. That would be my only point on that.
Yeah, and we haven't talked very much about resilience today, but absolutely really good point. Okay, last batch of questions up front, right at the back and over there.
Hello, I'm Jack. I'm on the 17, but we've had a couple of questions come in on the live stream online. One particularly interesting one was about leveraging finance beyond farmland. So what would the panel think is the best way to get incentives for nature restoration in parks, private and public gardens and places like that?
You said there are a couple?
And the other one, sorry, let me just get it up, was about carbon labelling, sorry, I think it's covered a bit by Siobhan, but if we want to go more into that in terms of supply chains, if companies...
Great, and just to clarify, so the first question was about leveraging finance
for public parks and gardens and places like that, rather beyond farmland.
Okay, great, thank you, Jack. And guy in blue at the back.
I'm happy to speak loudly if people can hear me. We've talked a lot about subsidy, tax system, donors as providers of finance, but what about the banking system? What is the panel seeing from the banking system, which is fundamental to pretty much every business running in this country, and what needs to change?
Okay, great question. Yes. Final question.
How do we ensure that private actors don't only invest on the project basis wise, invest in the cheapest projects and not those that have the greatest environmental benefit and also perhaps wider benefit to SDGs, often based on perhaps those cheaper projects, perhaps based on lap standards? How do we ensure that private actors investing in the best projects, best environmental and also the best benefit to SDGs?
Wonderful. So some really good questions. We're running out of time, so I'm going to ask each panellist to pick up on the threads that they want to pick up on, and particularly if Emily and Helen, I know you guys are doing lots of big things this year, and you've got the farming conference as well. If you could give us a little preview of things we should look forward to. But starting with Emily, and then we'll go down.
Conscious of time as well, you've got 2 minutes left. Parks and private gardens, really, really important, having super interesting conversation with a group of individuals we know as the Great Estates. They're all the bits of West London that became wealthy when West London was created in the 1850s. They have massive issues with homes overheating. And London becoming uninhabitable as a result of climate change. And the use of nature-based solutions and bringing more biodiversity and biophilia trees into cities in order to help cool our urban spaces is really, really important. So I think there's a lot that the public sector councils can do in order to create those, but working with private landlords undoubtedly, because they have got major issues around making their homes habitable long-term in the best interests of all of their tenants. So some super interesting stuff there. The banking system is really about differential pricing, so green loans essentially, but also farmers don't yet realise this, but their carbon information is under massive interest from lots of different directions. The banking system is one of them, supply chains is another. If you're a tenant farmer, we haven't even mentioned the tenant farmer sector and access to land, but land ownership as well, particularly for institutional investors. They are all interested in farmers' carbon, and farmers need to get some support, collaboration in order to be able to stand up to these actors, as George Eustace recommended at the Oxford Farming Conference.
Great. Matthew, super quick.
Yeah, just very briefly on the banking question. I think in terms of providing funds, getting involved, banks will want to see clearer, better standardisation of products and accreditation. I think if markets are going to work well, I think otherwise it's too difficult for them to price a risk. And in terms of banks lending to individual businesses, I think there is something about this idea of the nature positive obligation creating some liabilities for companies that are heavily dependent on natural resources, and I think banks do take notice of those sort of things.
On the parks point, I think it's all about figuring out who's benefiting, and that's the person who's going to buy that service. So in parks, it's very hard to price up, the odd concessionary stand, people just coming in and paying entries. You're not going to do that.
I would say check out, there's some really interesting things happening in the States. Quantified Ventures has just put in a huge bike track in southern Ohio through a forest to activate that forest. That's paid for by lodging taxes that have increased in towns that were just decimated, really, around the area. So it's also built rural economy. So it's just figuring out who benefits and then getting them to pay. That's always the key. On the banking system, I mean, for me, all roads lead to TNFD. Once that's there, then companies are going to start looking through their supply chains and then banks will come in and help them with sustainability-linked loans, sustainability notes that have nature-positive KPIs. They're trying to assess their risk of exposure to climate. Obviously, TNFD is coming and they'll do the same for nature. And I know they're working really hard at the moment to go through their loan portfolios and see how they can offer discount rate loans to farmers who are making transitions. But at the moment, there's just not the financial or regulatory push there for them to do that, so we need to sort of work on that. And that's the kind of thing we'll be working on the rest of the year, so watch this space.
Great.
Yeah, well, leveraging finance for land, just making sure that it washes its own face, and for wetlands, and my friends at the WWT, I mean, they genuinely are the most amazing experts, and they're trying to create something called the Salt Marsh Carbon Code, which will lead to a blue carbon code. And the reason for that is we need the structure at the moment to enable salt marsh carbon to be marketed and traded as carbon offsets, which is, to our friend with the bonds point, businesses need to know that they can invest in something, or something can be trusted, and it's going to be. So we've got to create those codes and do that work to start off with. So the APPG and a range of peers and experts and MPs are really looking at doing that. So it's quite an exciting prospect. And government did invest quite heavily in WWT last year in a range of projects. Ben and I were talking about the Somerset levels and just all the opportunities there. So if we can just sort of be creative with what we're doing with finance and the environment, I think we can make some really good progress.
Well said. Tom?
I'm going to respond to the point about carbon labelling and the banking system and go out on a bit of a limb here with a weird idea. I think that the initiatives like Science Based Targets Initiative or Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and the same one for nature, I mean, they're all helping to start recognizing the fact that large corporates and investors have these liabilities that are linked to the damage they've caused to the climate or nature, and to start to quantify them, and that's really important. But these quantification exercises, especially when you get outside of the scope of your immediate impact and you start talking about your supply chain, upstream and downstream, then it really starts getting a bit of a guessing game. And if we're ever going to reach the point where banking, starts measuring and taking responsibility for their liabilities, or you can have a label on a product, you need to actually quantify and track those liabilities throughout the entire supply chain, from the investors at the beginning of finance through to the creation of the product and its transformation and its final sale. And I think we need a liabilities system that tracks things like probably the tons of CO2 you've created, emitted, on balance sheets right the way through the supply chain in the same way that we track balance sheets of money. And I think that would actually, it would be a huge amount of work to set it up, but it would be quite transformational if we did.
Great. Okay, so we've covered a huge amount, lots to think about after this. I think one of the challenges, as I was saying at the beginning, is the lack of time that we have. And I think when we're thinking about all these wonderful ideas, what can we get away quickly? What can make a difference as soon as possible? Because we don't have any time.